I need to be honest with you about something. And I mean genuinely, uncomfortably honest. Not the kind of honest where a tech reviewer says they switched to Linux for a week and then goes back to Windows because they missed one specific game or because a printer didn't work. I mean the kind of honest where I tell you that something I used every single day for over 20 years, something I defended in arguments, something I recommended to friends and family, something I built my entire workflow around, now feels broken to me. Not technically broken, emotionally broken, spiritually broken. Broken in a way that I can't unsee and can't unfeel. I spent 30 days on Linux, not as an experiment, not as content, not as a challenge I planned to abandon at the end for a dramatic conclusion. I switched because I was curious, and I stayed because something happened that I wasn't prepared for. Something shifted in how I experience computers. And when I went back to Windows 11 on day 31 to grab some files I'd left behind, I sat down at my desktop, looked at my screen, and the first thought that entered my mind was completely involuntary. This feels like Adware, not like it has Adware, like it is Adware. Like the entire operating system, from the moment it boots to the moment it shuts down, is designed around the same principles that govern the worst software you've ever accidentally installed. Unwanted notifications, promoted products, redirected defaults, resistance to removal, background processes you didn't authorize, persistent, relentless, exhausting attempts to push you toward services and subscriptions you didn't ask for. I didn't think this before my 30 days on Linux. I thought Windows was fine, normal. The way computers work. I complained about the occasional annoyance, the way everyone complains, the way you complain about traffic or weather as background noise in a life that's otherwise acceptable. Windows was just what computers were. 30 days on Linux showed me that computers don't have to be this way. And once I saw the alternative, the reality of what Windows 11 has become snapped into focus with a clarity that was almost painful. Let me tell you exactly what happened, day by day. Because the transformation wasn't instant, it was gradual. And the gradual nature of it is what made it so powerful, because it meant I wasn't reacting to novelty. I was adjusting to a fundamentally different relationship between a person and their computer. Day one was awkward. I installed Linux Mint on my secondary laptop, a ThinkPad from 2020 that had been struggling with Windows 11. The installation took about 15 minutes. The desktop appeared. Taskbar at the bottom, menu button in the corner, system tray on the right. Everything was where I expected it to be, but everything was also slightly different. The font rendering was different. The window animations were different. The file manager was called Nemo instead of Explorer. Small things. Tiny friction points that my muscle memory noticed even when my conscious mind didn't. I spent the first hour just exploring, opening menus, clicking through settings, finding where things lived. It felt like moving into an apartment with the same floor plan as your old one, but different paint and different light fixtures. Familiar enough to navigate, different enough to notice. By the end of day one, I had installed Firefox, configured my email, set up my cloud storage through the browser, and was using the computer for basic work. Nothing remarkable, nothing transformative, just a computer doing computer things in a slightly different visual wrapper. Day three is when I noticed the first absence. I was writing a report in LibreOffice Writer. I had been working for about 45 minutes, and I suddenly realized that nothing had interrupted me. No notification had appeared in the corner of my screen. No pop-up had asked me to try a new feature. No prompt had suggested I sign into a service. No banner had recommended I update something. Nothing. 45 minutes of uninterrupted work. On Windows 11, this was functionally impossible. Not because interruptions came every 5 minutes, but because the possibility of interruption kept a fraction of my attention, always monitoring, always ready to dismiss the next notification, always peripherally aware that my operating system might demand something from me at any moment. On day three, that monitoring stopped. My brain noticed the silence and, for the first time, fully relaxed into the work. The quality of my focus was different, not dramatically, not like a switch flipped, but perceptibly, measurably. I wrote more in that session than I typically wrote in a comparable period on Windows, not because Linux made me type faster, because nothing was stealing slices of my attention. Day 5 is when I noticed the second absence. I was browsing the web in Firefox. I opened a new tab and typed a search query into the address bar. The search ran. Results appeared. I clicked a link. The page loaded. Normal, boring, everyday web browsing. And then I realized what hadn't happened. No Bing redirect, no Edge suggestion, no try Microsoft Edge for a faster browsing experience notification, no set Edge as your default prompt, no widgets panel sliding in from the left with news stories I didn't ask for, no discover content interrupting my workflow, no sponsored links in my start menu related to my browsing patterns. The web browser just browsed the web. That was its entire job. And it did that job without commentary, without suggestions, without trying to redirect me to a different browser, a different search engine, a different content feed. The simplicity was startling, not because Firefox on Linux is dramatically different from Firefox on Windows, because everything around Firefox on Linux is different. The operating system doesn't interfere with the browser. It doesn't try to replace the browser. It doesn't insert itself between you and the web with promotional content and default overrides. Day 8 is when I noticed the third absence. My laptop's battery lasted almost 2 hours longer than it had on Windows 11. Same hardware, same usage patterns, same brightness, same workload. 2 additional hours. I checked the system monitor. At idle, Linux Mint was using about 700 megabytes of RAM and negligible CPU. On Windows 11, the same machine at idle used between 3 and 3.5 gigabytes of RAM with visible CPU activity from background services. The difference was being consumed by processes that served Microsoft, not me. Telemetry, search indexing, OneDrive sync monitoring, widget updates, update checking, Copilot readiness services. All of it consuming power, generating heat, spinning fans, draining battery, for purposes that had nothing to do with the work I was trying to do. Removing those processes didn't just make the computer faster, it made the computer quieter. The fans that used to spin during idle periods stayed silent. The laptop that ran warm on my desk ran cool. The battery that died at 3 in the afternoon lasted until 5. The hardware didn't change. The demands on the hardware changed. And the demands decreased dramatically because the operating system stopped making demands on behalf of a corporation. Day 12 is when I noticed the fourth absence. I realized I hadn't thought about my operating system in 4 days. Not once. I hadn't opened settings to check anything. I hadn't dismissed a notification. I hadn't investigated a mysterious background process in the system. Monitor. I hadn't wondered whether an update was going to restart my computer. I hadn't checked whether a default had been changed. The operating system had become invisible. It was doing its job so quietly, so unobtrusively, so completely without drama that I forgot it existed. I opened my laptop, did my work, closed my laptop. The intermediary between me and my tasks had vanished. There was no intermediary. There was just me and my work. On Windows, the operating system is never invisible. It's always there, always reminding you of its presence. Always notifying, always suggesting, always updating, always inserting itself into the space between you and what you're trying to do. You don't notice this because you've never experienced the alternative. The presence feels normal because you've never known absence. I knew absence now, and the presence, when I finally encountered it again on day 31, was unbearable. Day 15 is when I stopped thinking of this as an experiment and started thinking of it as a migration. Not because I made a conscious decision, because I realized that I hadn't booted my Windows machine in over a week and hadn't missed it, not once, not for a single task. Everything I needed to do, I was doing on Linux: email, documents, spreadsheets, web browsing, video calls, media consumption, file management, at every single daily task, handled without compromise, without workarounds, without missing features. The computer that Microsoft said needed Windows was doing everything I needed without Windows, and it was doing it faster, quieter, longer on battery, and without ever once demanding my attention for something I didn't initiate. That's when I knew. Not that Linux was better in some abstract philosophical sense. That Windows had been making my life worse in concrete, measurable, daily ways that I had normalized into invisibility. And 30 days of living without those degradations had made them impossible to ignore. Day 18 is when I started testing the things that are supposed to be deal breakers. The things that every Linux skeptic raises as proof that switching is impractical, because 15 days of smooth sailing on basic productivity tasks didn't address the hard questions. What about the edge cases? What about the specific software? What about the workflows that supposedly chain people to Windows permanently? I tested gaming first, because gaming has been the ultimate trump card in every Linux versus Windows argument for 20 years. If you game, you need Windows. Period. End of discussion. That was the conventional wisdom. And for a very long time, it was correct. I installed Steam from the software manager. One click. Steam installed. I logged into my account. My library appeared. Hundreds of games, all purchased on Windows, all listed and ready. I picked a game I'd been playing regularly on Windows, a demanding title, GPU intensive, the kind of game that would expose any performance gap between operating systems. I clicked play. Steam activated Proton, the compatibility layer that translates Windows API calls into Linux-compatible instructions. The game launched, the main menu appeared. I started playing, and it ran. It technically ran, but the experience was degraded. It ran well. Frame rates were comparable to what I'd seen on Windows. In some scenes, the frames were actually higher because Linux wasn't burning GPU, resources on compositor effects, background services, and the visual overhead that Windows 11 imposes even during full-screen gaming. I tested 5 more games over the next 2 days. 4 ran flawlessly through Proton without any configuration. 1 required a small tweak that I found on ProtonDB in about 30 seconds. The community had documented the exact issue and the exact fix. Total troubleshooting time across 6 games, approximately 2 minutes. The gaming deal breaker, the argument that kept me on Windows for years longer than necessary, was gone. Not weakened, not partially addressed. Gone. The games I actually played worked on Linux, and the performance was equivalent or better because the operating system wasn't competing with my games for system resources. Day 20 is when I tested professional tools. I use LibreOffice for most document work, and the compatibility with Microsoft formats had been good throughout the experiment. But I needed to test specific scenarios, documents with complex formatting, spreadsheets with extensive formulas, presentations with embedded media, and animations. I opened a client report I had originally created in Word, complex formatting, headers, footers, table of contents, embedded images, multi-column layouts, track changes. LibreOffice Writer opened it in about 3 seconds. The formatting was preserved. Not perfectly in every micro detail. A text box was shifted by about 2 millimeters. A font substitution had changed the line spacing on one page, but the document was readable, professional, and usable. The adjustments took less than a minute. I opened a financial spreadsheet from Excel, 47 formulas, conditional formatting, pivot tables, charts, LibreOffice. Calc handled it without issue. Every formula calculated correctly. The charts rendered. The pivot tables worked. The conditional formatting was preserved. For the presentation, I opened a PowerPoint file with animations and transitions. LibreOffice Impress rendered the slides correctly. Some transition effects were slightly different from their PowerPoint equivalents. The content, the actual substance of the presentation, was completely intact. Could I find edge cases where LibreOffice doesn't perfectly replicate Microsoft Office behavior? Yes. Complex VBA macros, highly specific formatting dependencies, niche Excel features that LibreOffice implements differently. These edge cases exist, but they affect a small minority of documents created by a small minority of users. For the documents I actually create and receive in my actual work, the compatibility was functionally seamless. And for the rare situations where perfect Microsoft Office compatibility is essential, I discovered that Microsoft's own Office 365 runs in the browser on Linux, Word Online, Excel Online, PowerPoint Online, identical to the Windows browser experience, identical interface, identical functionality for web-based editing, available in Firefox on Linux without any modification or workaround. The professional tools deal breaker dissolved alongside the gaming deal breaker, not because Linux replicated the Windows software ecosystem perfectly, because Linux provided enough compatibility and enough alternatives that every practical need was met. Day 22 is when something unexpected happened. I started enjoying my computer, not tolerating it, not accepting it as a necessary tool for getting work done, enjoying it, taking pleasure in the act of sitting down, opening my laptop, and using a machine that responded to my input with speed, silence, and absolute predictability. I realized that I hadn't enjoyed using a computer in years. Windows had turned computing into an adversarial relationship. Every session involved friction, dismissing notifications, waiting for processes I didn't start, navigating around promoted content, reestablishing defaults that had been silently changed, managing an operating system that constantly demanded management. On Linux, there was nothing to manage. The system I configured on day 1 was the system that greeted me on day 22. Every setting exactly as I'd left it. Every default unchanged. Every preference preserved. No surprises. No unwanted changes. No silent modifications by a corporation that decided it knew better than me how my computer should be configured. This stability created something I hadn't expected. Trust. I trusted my computer. I trusted that when I opened it tomorrow, it would be exactly the way it was today. I trusted that no update would change my settings. I trusted that no service would redirect my defaults. I trusted that no feature would appear uninvited. I trusted that the machine would do what I told it and nothing else. I hadn't trusted my computer in years. On Windows, trust was impossible because the operating system was constantly proving itself untrustworthy, not through dramatic betrayals, through 1,000 tiny violations. A default changed here, a notification added there, a service enabled without asking, a promotion inserted into the Start menu, each one insignificant individually, each one eroding trust incrementally. until trust was gone entirely, replaced by a resigned vigilance that I had mistaken for normal. Day 25 is when I started thinking about what I would tell other people, because the experience I was having wasn't niche, it wasn't technical, it wasn't specific to my workflow or my hardware or my level of expertise. It was universal. Any person who uses a computer for mainstream tasks, browsing, email, documents, media, basic gaming, would have this experience. The speed improvement, the silence, the stability, the absence of interruption, the trust. And the thing that made it universal was also the thing that made it damning for Windows. Because the improvements I was experiencing weren't things Linux had added. They were things Windows had removed. Linux didn't give me fast boot times. Windows had taken them away, with bloated startup services. Linux didn't give me quiet fans. Windows had forced them to spin with unnecessary background processes. Linux didn't give me uninterrupted focus. Windows had destroyed it with notifications and promotions. Linux didn't give me stability. Windows had undermined it with forced updates and silent configuration changes. Every positive experience on Linux was a mirror image of a negative experience on Windows, and the reflection showed something I couldn't look away from. Windows 11 wasn't a product that served its users with some annoying side effects. It was a product that served Microsoft with some residual user functionality. The primary purpose of Windows 11 was data collection, advertising delivery, subscription conversion, and ecosystem lock-in. The ability to do work was secondary. Permitted, but secondary. Tolerated as long as it didn't interfere with the real business of extracting value from the person sitting in front of the screen. Day 28 is when I stopped thinking about Linux as an alternative and started thinking about Windows as an imposition. Because the framing matters. When you call Linux an alternative, you position Windows as the default, the norm, the standard against which alternatives are measured. That framing gives Windows a legitimacy it no longer deserves. Windows is not the default because it's the best operating system. It's the default because of licensing agreements with hardware manufacturers, pre-installation deals that put Windows on every computer before consumers have a choice, enterprise contracts that lock organizations into the ecosystem, and 30 years of accumulated inertia from users who learned computing on Windows and never questioned whether they had to stay. The default isn't a quality judgment, it's a market position. A market position maintained not by being better, but by being unavoidable. Linux is better, not in every scenario, not for every user, not in every edge case, but for the daily, mainstream, ordinary computing that the vast majority of people do on their computers every single day. Linux is faster, cleaner, more private, more stable, more respectful, and more pleasant to use than Windows 11. That's not ideology. That's 30 days of direct, personal, documented experience. The kind of experience that doesn't require technical expertise to evaluate, the kind that anyone can verify by downloading a Linux distribution, burning it to a USB drive, and booting from it for an afternoon. Day 30, the last day of my experiment. I sat down at my Linux laptop in the morning. I worked through the day. I checked email. I wrote documents. I browsed the web. I watched a video during lunch. I managed files. I ran a spreadsheet. I played a game in the evening. At no point during the day did my operating system demand anything from me. At no point did it interrupt me. At no point did it promote a product, suggest a subscription, or change a setting. At no point did it phone home to a corporate server for purposes that served someone else. At no point did it take a screenshot of my activity. At no point did it feel like anything other than a tool doing exactly what I asked. Day 31 is when I went back to Windows, and that's when everything fell apart. I booted my Windows 11 desktop on day 31 to transfer some files I'd left on the machine. I pressed the power button, sat down, and waited. The boot took over a minute. I had forgotten. After 30 days of 14-second boot times on Linux, a 60-plus second boot felt like an eternity. The spinning dots on the Windows logo screen, the slow fade to the lock screen, the pause after entering my password, while the desktop loaded, the additional delay while startup programs and background services initialized. By the time I had a usable desktop, I could have booted my Linux laptop, opened a browser, checked my email, and started working. But the boot time wasn't what hit me. What hit me was what happened next. 3 notifications appeared in the lower right corner within the first 30 seconds. The first was a Windows Update notification informing me that updates had been downloaded and were ready to install. I hadn't asked for updates. I hadn't approved the download. The operating system had decided on its own to use my bandwidth and storage to download software I hadn't requested. The second notification was from Microsoft Edge, which I hadn't opened, asking me to set it as my default browser. I had set Firefox as my default months ago. Edge was reminding me that it still existed and still wanted to be chosen. A browser I wasn't using was advertising itself to me, from within my operating system. The third notification was from OneDrive, informing me that files needed to be synced. Files in my Documents folder had been queued for upload to Microsoft's cloud servers, not because I had asked for this, because OneDrive was configured during initial setup when Windows forced me to sign into a Microsoft account, and it had been monitoring my folders ever since. 3 notifications, 30 seconds. Not one of them was for me. All 3 were for Microsoft. An update Microsoft wanted me to install, a browser Microsoft wanted me to use, a cloud service Microsoft wanted me to feed with my files. I dismissed the notifications. I opened the Start menu to navigate to my files, and there, in the recommended section of the Start menu, were 3 promoted applications I had never installed, never requested, and never expressed any interest in. Applications that Microsoft had decided to suggest to me based on data they had collected about my usage patterns, advertisements, in my Start menu. In the operating system I had paid for. In 30 days on Linux, I had seen 0 promoted applications, 0 browser advertisements, 0 Cloud Sync notifications I hadn't configured, 0 update downloads I hadn't authorized, 0. The number wasn't low, it was 0. I navigated to File Explorer to find the files I needed. File Explorer opened slowly, noticeably slower than Nemo on Linux Mint. And when it opened, I noticed something I had never consciously registered before. OneDrive was integrated directly into the navigation sidebar. My Documents folder showed a cloud icon indicating its sync status with Microsoft's servers. The file manager itself was partially an advertising surface for a cloud storage subscription. I right-clicked the desktop to access display settings. The context menu appeared with a slight delay. On Linux, context menus appeared instantaneously. On Windows, there was a perceptible pause, a fraction of a second, a hiccup that I had never noticed, before 30 days of instant response times. The delay wasn't caused by my hardware. My desktop has an SSD, 16 gigabytes of RAM, and a modern processor. The delay was caused by the operating system doing things between my click and the menu's appearance. Loading shells, extensions, checking cloud status, processing context, things that had nothing to do with showing me a list of options. I opened Task Manager out of morbid curiosity. 163 processes running. I had nothing open except File Explorer. 63 processes consuming memory, CPU cycles, and system resources for purposes I had never authorized, and in most cases couldn't identify without researching each one individually. On my Linux machine with the same applications open, the system monitor showed 61 processes, every one of them identifiable, every one of them serving a function I understood, every one of them there because the operating system needed it to do the job I was asking it to do. The difference wasn't abstract anymore, it was visceral. I was looking at my Windows desktop with new eyes, eyes that had spent 30 days in an environment free of corporate manipulation. And what I saw wasn't an operating system, it was a storefront, a data collection, apparatus dressed up as a computing environment, a machine that existed to serve Microsoft first and me second, with the gap between first and second growing wider with every update. I copied my files to a USB drive. It took about 10 minutes. During those 10 minutes, 2 more. Notifications appeared. One from Windows Security telling me my protection was up to date, which was useful information delivered with a banner that also reminded me about Microsoft's premium security features. One from the Get Windows app suggesting I explore features I might have missed, which was pure marketing dressed as helpfulness. 5 notifications in less than 15 minutes, each one requiring a moment of attention, a decision to dismiss, a micro interruption in whatever I was doing. Not one of them originated from something I was trying to accomplish. I ejected the USB drive. I shut down the Windows machine. And as the shutdown screen appeared, Windows informed me that updates would be installed during shutdown. I hadn't approved these updates. I hadn't chosen this moment. The operating system was informing me that it would be modifying itself using my electricity, my time, and my hardware on its schedule, according to its priorities. I sat there, watching the installing updates, don't turn off your computer screen, and I thought about the 30 days I had just spent on a computer that never once told me what it was going to do to itself. A computer that never installed anything without my explicit approval. A computer that shut down when I told it to shut down, in the time it took to shut down, without inserting a maintenance task into my departure. The contrast was complete, and the conclusion was inescapable. Windows 11 feels like Adware because Windows 11 behaves like Adware. It displays promotional content you didn't request. It redirects you toward services you didn't choose. It runs background processes that serve the distributor rather than the user. It resists removal of components you don't want. It reinstalls features you've disabled after updates. It collects behavioral data to target its promotions more effectively. It uses dark patterns to make opting out harder than opting in. These are not the characteristics of a tool designed to serve its user. These are the characteristics of software designed to extract value from its user. The distinction between Windows 11 and traditional adware isn't one of kind. It's one of degree. Adware is crude, obvious, and immediately annoying. Windows 11 is sophisticated, subtle, and gradually normalized, but the underlying architecture is the same. Software that prioritizes the interests of its distributor over the interests of its user. I didn't see this before my 30 days on Linux. I couldn't see it because I had nothing to compare it to. Windows was my only frame of reference. Its behavior was my baseline. Its interruptions were my normal. Its promotional content was my expected environment. I had adapted to it the way a person adapts to a noisy neighborhood, not by ceasing to be affected by the noise, but by ceasing to notice it. Linux gave me silence. Real, genuine, structural silence. Not the silence of turning notifications off, which I had tried on Windows and which Windows routinely circumvented through update reset cycles and new notification categories. The silence of an operating system that generates zero noise because it has zero incentive to generate noise. No ads to serve, no subscriptions to push, no browsers to promote, no cloud services to feed, no engagement metrics to optimize, no quarterly revenue targets that depend on capturing my attention. That silence changed me. It reset my baseline. It recalibrated my expectations. And when I returned to Windows, the noise was deafening, not because the noise had gotten louder, because I had finally heard what silence sounded like. I went back to my Linux laptop that evening. I opened it. The desktop appeared in 14 seconds. No notifications, no promotions, no suggestions, no updates installing without my consent. Just a clean desktop, waiting patiently for me to decide what I wanted to do. And I decided that I was never going back to Windows. Not as a dramatic statement, not as a protest, as a simple, practical, quality of life decision. The same kind of decision you make when you move to a quieter apartment, switch to a mechanic who doesn't upsell you, or find a doctor who listens instead of rushing. A decision to stop tolerating something that you've realized you don't have to tolerate. Windows 11 feels like adware because it is adware. Sophisticated, normalized, operating system level adware that has been integrated so deeply into the computing experience that most people can't distinguish it from the computing experience itself. 30 days on Linux showed me the difference. The difference isn't subtle, it isn't marginal, it isn't a matter of opinion or preference. It's the difference between a tool that works for you and a tool that works on you. Between a computer that serves your interests and a computer that serves a corporation's interests while occupying your desk. I spent 30 days on Linux. Now Windows 11 feels like adware. Not because Linux changed my perspective, because Linux showed me what my perspective had been trained to ignore. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Not ever. Not for a single moment. Every notification, every promotion, every background process, every forced update, every redirected default screams what it always was. You just couldn't hear it over the noise.